We shall continue with some more Lamento today. Let's hope the first sentence doesn't disappear. We'll see how long. Maybe I can get half an hour for this episode. Probably not longer, but I want to pre-produce a little bit every day at least, so that I can have a bit of a backlog. Yeah. Remember, we went to dancing. Illuminated under the moon of light, Lansing looked even more disorderly than the night before. The streets were thrumming with cats and peddlers. It did not put the sentence there. Oh well.
呪術師を訪ねる。
呪術師？
乱戦近くの森に裂き身ができる呪術師が住んでいるという噂がある。かなりの高齢で知識も相当深いらしい。お前のことも何かわかるかもしれない。
その呪術師のいる場所は分かってるのか？
詳しくは知らん。聞いて回るか。勘で森を探すしかないな。
In the forest. One was embarrassed by Irai's calm retort and abruptly shut his mouth.
行き当たりばったりだろ、あんた。
お前の剣が飛び入りなんだろ。
It was probably true.
なるようにしかならん。俺も別に乱戦に詳しいというわけじゃない。とりあえず酒場を探すぞ。
A bar? I mean, okay. Konoe walked after Irai. He definitely didn't want to get separated again, but his eyes kept wandering over to the stores. Extravagant decorations caught his attention. Now that Konoe thought about it, that innkeeper Bado had mentioned some kind of winter festival. Were these stores beginning to line up their wares for the festival? He just wanted to take a quick look. He walked the streets for a while, struggling against the waves of cats. His view was assailed by information, but his eyes began to gradually block it out. This looks fancy, but also very unstable. Only grey scenery passed by him. Suddenly, in the midst of this, he sensed the presence of a vivid color. Konoe looked back. A cat stood stock still in the back alley. No, it wasn't a cat. What protruded from its head were not ears. Those were horns. Time seemed to slow down. His heart began to race. In the back of his mind was a snake. Its slippery tail sliding, the yellow snake began to undulate. Konoe's pupils narrowed into slits. He stopped and looked back towards the alley.
Oi! どこ行く? Oi!
By the time he heard Rai's voice, he had already broken off into a run. He pushed through the crowd towards the grey alleys. Why would you run after this, really? He stepped into the dim and narrow entrance. The not cat was still standing there. Light billowed around it like waves of heat. There was no mistake. That was a devil.
あれは
Rai had chased him and stood by his side, furrowing his brows with a frown to peer into the depths of the alley. The devil slowly drew closer. It was different from the previous one. The devil before Konoe had a golden presence. It slowly hoisted up an arm. Was that electricity? At this rate, it would cause an uproar on the main street.
待て!
Konoe drew his sword and began to sprint towards the golden devil. However, there was neither the light nor the impact he was expecting. The golden shadow of an arm swung downward, and a slim electric current ran forth. It made a sound like crackling flames and began to cover the devil's entire arm. This time, the shadow rushed towards Konoe as well. Konoe quickly swung his sword, using its tip to cut across the shadow's chest. The tip of the sword slashed diagonally at the breast of the shadow. There was no response. Konoe heard a harsh cracking. The shadow did not even flinch. Did it not feel pain? The arm covered in electric current bore down on him. Reflexively, he closed his eyes. However, a dull sound echoed through Konoe's ears. He lifted his face. A sword was thrust out from behind Konoe and it sliced deeply right into the forehead of the golden shadow. Even though the shadow's face was turned to the side, it was blurry and Konoe couldn't discern anything other than smiling lips. It was horribly ominous. Before long, a small crack ran from the middle of its forehead where the sword had pierced it. The crack spread through the shadow's entire body. It was the same. The same as the red shadow he saw in the forest. As Rai withdrew his sword, the golden shadow made a delicate sound and shattered into pieces. It was that same dishearteningly abrupt conclusion as last time. The fragments glittered as they scattered, dancing through the darkness of the alley. Oh my. He looked back, offended by Ray's exasperated, ridiculing voice.
後先考えずに飛び出すな。死ぬぞ。
しょうがないだろ。表通りまで被害が出たら騒ぎになる。
True.
今のは
Before Konoe could tell him it was a devil, Rai opened his mouth again.
本体じゃないな。
知ってるのか？
魔物の類を狙う賞金稼ぎであれば、大概は知っている。
That meant Rai was that particular type of a bounty hunter.
無駄に体力を消耗した。
Rai sheathed his sword, his coat billowing as he turned on his heel. He just doesn't give a damn. He does not care. Konoe followed Rai, glancing once back towards the alley. Why did the devil's shadow appear in the city? He could still make some sense of seeing one in the woods, but were they aiming for him? Konoe looked to the streets, uneasy. A single street extended from the main road. It was a dark and narrow alley, unlike the wide main road. The lively crowds began to fade away, and a stale air began to drift in. He saw a vagrant dressed in tattered clothing sitting on the side of the road.
どこへ向かってるんだ？
酒場だ。表より裏にある酒場の方が何かと情報を入手しやすい。
They each gave the huddled cat a strange look as they passed. He was missing an arm, as though he'd caught the sickness. Come to think of it, Tokino once said that Ransen had an outbreak of the sickness. The victims of the outbreak just couldn't be seen on the main road. Sorry. The people who caught it probably fled to the back alleys, cast out into the unseen, sullen part of town. A sour smell reached his nose. The scent here was truly revolting. These streets were filled with vulgar stores unlike the main street, and Kono's fur bristled on end as he stood on guard with an unfamiliar wariness. Ahead, two cats wearing tattered looking clothes and covered by their hoods leaned against the wall. Their eyes followed Rai and Konoe. The two of them each held a bottle of liquor in their hand and talked to each other about something amongst themselves. But when Konoe and Rai passed, they called out.
Oi.
Rai stopped and looked at them. Their faces could not be seen, shrouded under their hoods.
なんだ
どこへ行く
関係ないだろ
When Rai answered coldly, the two of them exchanged glances and laughed.
叱られたよ。
叱られたね。
関係ないんだって。
関係ないのか。
Ayo. Their similar voices alternated back and forth.
気味悪いな。
構うな行くぞ
Once more they began to walk forward.
黒い猫連れてどこ行くの
呪われた猫連れてどこ行くの
Their repeating words made Konoe halt. What did they just say? The two cats stood side by side when he looked back. They vigorously raised each bottle they held over their heads and flung them to the ground. Why? One after the other, the sound of shattering glass echoed.
黒い猫は黒くなったんだろ
Oh.
黒い猫は元は違う色だったんだろ
Oh.
なんで黒くなったんだ
なんで黒くなったんだろうね
Well.
お前ら何なんだ
Konoe glared at the two cats.
挑発だ乗るな
Rai grasped his shoulder. Konoe understood. They were baiting him. But he couldn't afford to let them intimidate him. The two cats exchanged glances and chuckled.
教えてあげようかウル
Uru.
教えてあげようよキル
Uru to kiru ka. After speaking amongst themselves, the two of them nodded and turned back towards Konoe and Rai, each removing its hood. Two identical faces appeared. Twins. Other than the color of their hair, Konoe couldn't tell them apart. Rai seemed cautious and bared his fangs. So did Konoe. From the two cats, a black aura slowly billowed outward. It looked like some kind of eerie illusion. These were not ordinary vagrants.
貴様ら何者だ
なんだと思う
なんだろうね
知ったところで無駄だ
I'm hungry.
無駄だね
お前らここで
死ぬからね
Nice. Very welcoming. Very nice. The cat named Uru pulled his coat and raised one arm with a thin smile. Konoe was captivated by that arm. There were a great number of red lines, scars, that ran everywhere, both horizontally and vertically. But what Uru did next made Konoe's eyes widen. He used the claws of his other hand to rake at the scars on his arm without hesitation. Blood oozed out and began to drip. Just looking at it hurt. Rai clicked his tongue and drew his sword. He was about to attack Uru, but then a sword was thrust out from beside him to block the attack.
させない
Kiru stood in the way, horizontally wielding a dagger on his own. He smiled horrifically as if to provoke Rai. Rai jumped back, returning to Konoe's side.
厄介だな
何やってるんだあい
See
つ
it, like summoning stuff. Konoe's eyes were still glued to Uru's strange behavior.
サン
Ah. Oh. Rai said with a hint of annoyance.
サンガ
あ
Aitsu wa. Sorry, I skipped that part. Again, he looked at Uru. Uru took his claws into his arm and closed his eyes in an euphoric trance.
痛みが響く痛みが叫ぶ体中の痛みが奏でるよ
Well. Something flooded into Konoe's stomach, heavy as mud. He recognized something was happening to his body. This was a melody. A heavy, heavy melody. That cat. He was singing.
痛みで歌う山岳か。
Crazy.
痛みで
What a masochist.
普通の山岳は楽器やね声で歌うが、あいつの場合は痛みを覚えた時に反応する感覚を旋律として発している。己の
Oh. Such things really existed? He stared at Uru in disbelief.
跳ねる跳ねる血の旋律。俺の体が生み出す俺たちのための歌。
Hame no uta, a song. The claw slid over the scars as if he were simply playing an instrument. Didn't he feel pain? Still, when Konoe looked closely, he saw beads of sweat run on Uru's forehead. Ever since they encountered these two, Konoe felt things were terribly strange. There were no feelings coming from either of them. They smiled. They seemed joyful. They looked as if this was fun. However, there were no emotions, not even anger or madness. These two, it was as if these two were artificial. Like the devil's shadow he saw. Fresh, vibrant blood dripped down from Uru's wounds, down to his elbow and then to the ground. Before long, a slender tendril of warm light began flowing from Uru to Kiru. As his heart pounded away in his chest, Konoe heard someone quickly ask him this. Rai was right. He was a sangha. But he didn't know how to just start singing so suddenly.
まだよくわからない。俺とあんたで戦っても無理なのか。
無理だな。
Penetrating the bottom of his gut, the heavy melody continued. Around Uru's feet, there was a puddle of bright red.
やるよ、ウル。やれよ、キル。
An unpleasant smile ran across both their faces at the same time.
来るぞ。
Kiru kicked off the ground and propelled his body forward. For a moment, it felt like only the wind passed by. It happened in the blink of an eye. An ear-piercing sound resounded. Kiru swung his sword down from overhead and clashed blades with Rai. As a result of his sangha song, both of Kiru's arms were tainted red up till the elbow. With nothing but madness in his face, he spoke with a low laugh.
死ね。
Rai grit his teeth and was gradually forced back. Rai being pushed back. He was being overtaken. What incredible power. While their swords still crossed, Kiru gleefully met his eye without Konoe.
お前か、呪われた猫。災いの猫。災いをもたらす猫。お前なんかいらない猫。
Rude? That's very rude.
なんだと。
お前がいても邪魔なだけだ。早いとこ死んじゃえば。
That is such a rude thing to say, man. A low growl leaked from Konoe's throat. His hand subconsciously drew his sword.
バカら、逃げろ。
Rai noticed Konoe's presence and yelled out, still crossing swords with Kiru. Though he heard Rai's voice, he did not hear his words. He should stop the sangha song. If he did that, they could defeat the Toga. Blinded by anger, this was the only thing Konoe could think. He pounced towards Uru, but then his line of vision was suddenly obstructed. It was Kiru, who had just been fighting Rai, smiling.
死のう
No! He put his hand to the blade of his sword and held it up to protect his head. His vision darkened and shook, and a shock coursed through the bones of his arm. His body seemed to float in the air. He had been sent flying. His back hit the ground hard. He tried to get up when something suddenly pulled his arm with all his might.
走れ
でも
死にたいのかバカ猫
Rai caught his arm and they broke into a run. The dark blood song chased after them. They ran through the narrow streets. The vagrant cats of the street glared at them, their eyes turned down. Rai occasionally parried Kiro's blade whenever it came too close, and gradually opened the distance between them. Dazzling light flashed each time their swords met. They exited the back alleys and leapt into the main road in a frenzy. It caused quite a stir. Clamor arose. The calls of the street merchants quieted, and instead there were several cries from the stores, which aroused screams among the chaos. Then there was the sound of something collapsing.
どけ
What was happening around them? Konoe did not have time to look. They determinedly pushed the waves of cats aside and ran. That black song would surely catch up, but then it began to quiet down. His shaky breaths and the pounding of his heart shook his eardrums. He heard the rush of wind against his ears. The wind that sliced by his ears was cold to the touch. In the midst of it all, a different sound joined in.
この絵
Ah? He turned around and looked back. Looking amongst the noisy and confused cats one by one, he spotted a familiar face. His eyes widened. That was...
時のこっち
Konoe shook off Rai's hand that held his arm and grabbed hold of him in return.
いいから
Konoe ran towards where Tokino was, dragging along a perplexed Rai. Tokino immediately turned on his heels and ran into a back alley. Konoe followed him without a second thought. In the alley, the cats had to walk in a line, as it was very narrow and only allowed 2 cats to walk side by side at most. To make matters worse, there were many corners. Tokino weaved left and right. Konoe ran after him while still grasping Rai's arm. His swaying tail rubbed against the wall as he went. Before long, they came out into a small but wider, low-lying road. Tokino stopped and stood before a small house. Both Rai and Konoe stopped and checked behind them. It didn't seem as if those twin cats would pursue them here.
ここ入って
Tokino opened the door, inviting Konoe and Rai inside. When Tokino closed the door, he stopped. He stooped forward, his shoulders heaving with exhausted breathing, until he let out a huge sigh.
はあこんなに走ったの久しぶりだここは
His home, obviously.
俺の家父さんは今行商で出てるから俺一人だよ
Lifting his face, Konoe quickly glanced around the room. While there wasn't anything distinctively special, the room gave off an air of coziness and warmth because of its simplicity. It was also relatively neat and tidy. Still, in several places, Konoe could see large packages wrapped in cloth and huge baskets on the floor. Of course, they were merchant cats. Were these the wares they would put up for sale?
びっくりしただって通りが騒がしいから何かと思ったらいきなり近衛が見えたからさまさか乱戦にいるとは思わなかったよこの間行商で家老に行ったら近衛はいないし村の猫たちはピリピリしてるし
お
そうか
Konoe's voice softened and sounded a little gloomy. Tokino took out something from his coat pocket. It was a coin. A coin. Come to think of it, it was the message he had left for Tokino.
これ置いてったろ。近衛がお金を手にしてるとこめったに見たことないからさ。多分何かあったんだろうとは思ったけど、でも会えて本当によかった。さっきは逃げてるみたいだったけど、どうしたんだ？
Konoe fell silent. He bitterly recalled the void in the forest. He couldn't just explain it all so suddenly. There was simply no way to do it.
あれ
Okay, my recording crashed because storage was full. I switched it to my other hard drive. When Konoe looked up, he met Tokino's startled eyes. He inadvertently touched his head. His hood had come off. It was because he had been sprinting at full speed. He could hear the sound of blood rushing through to his ears. Tokino's eyes moved from his ears down to his feet. Even though he knew there was no point, Konoe curled his black tail in a ball behind him, trying to hide it.
そんな色じゃなかったよな。
What should he do? He didn't want to think about it. What would Tokino think of the state he was in now? Maybe he wouldn't think it was so bad, or maybe he wouldn't think Konoe was creepy. He clenched his sweaty palm slowly. Lowering his head, Konoe bit his lip. Every second that ticked by pierced him like a needle. Finally, Tokino let out a small sigh.
まあいいや。いろいろ事情があるんだろ。立ち話もなんだしさ。急ぎの用があるとかじゃないなら上がってってよ。もしよかったら話を聞かせて。
Konoe looked at Tokino. Nothing had changed. He was smiling just like always. The base of Konoe's tail trembled. He tried to speak but felt tongue-tied.
いやでもいきなり悪いだろ。
全然。一人で退屈してたとこだったから。
Tokino welcomed them into his room with a wave of his hand. He was a little leery, but there was no reason not to believe Tokino. Nevertheless, he was glad things had not changed here. Konoe wholeheartedly let himself feel relieved. He raised his ears and tail before nodding.
知り合いか。
Rai, who had been silent until now, opened his mouth. Konoe knew from his flat voice that Rai was wary of Tokino.
ああ、どうも。時野って言います。
Tokino quickly bowed his head. He looked nervous. He probably felt as daunted as Konoe did when he met Rai for the first time. When his eyes had met Rai's single blue eye, his breath had caught.
時野こいつは。
信用できるのか。
Ignoring Konoe's attempts to introduce Tokino, Rai uttered these rude words. Konoe reflexively glared at him.
なんだよいきなり。
信用できるのかと聞いている。
Rai cast a cold look at Tokino, then at Konoe. Tokino was the one who helped them out of trouble. Feeling a bit angry, Konoe fixed his eyes on Rai.
時野は家老の頃からの付き合いだ。信用って言うならあんたよりよっぽどできる。
Yeah, I would too.
どうだかな。
嫌なら出ていけばいいだろう。
Tokino spoke up, confused and flustered by the near nervousness and tension in the air.
積もる話もあるんでしょうけど、とりあえず奥行きませんか。
It was an argument rather than a conversation, but Konoe closed his mouth, feeling sorry for putting Tokino in such a state of bewilderment. Rai cast his eye down reluctantly and sighed.
悪い。こいつはライだ。ムカついたら無視していいから。
Valid. Feeling like it was just stabbed, Konoe ignored Rai's piercing gaze right away. Bringing the increasingly flustered Tokino along, Konoe and Rai moved inside the room. Konoe briefly told Tokino about all that had happened. Tokino listened to his story earnestly. When the story ended, the sky had already become dark. Konoe exhaled softly before biting into one of the nuts Tokino had prepared for them. Before his eyes, a bowl of water was set down. It was something Tokino had prepared just for him.
今の全部本当の話。
こんなことで嘘ついても仕方ない。
そりゃそうだよな。うん。
Tokino averted his eyes to the floor, still looking quite doubtful. In truth, Konoe had left some things out of the story. First, he didn't talk about Firi or the devils. He felt that talking about these things would get Tokino too involved in all this. Then, there was the part of him awakening as a Sangha. He didn't need to talk about that, and he didn't want to mention it either. He hadn't talked about Firi to Rai either, but he intended to tell him later. Since they were working together, it was for the best if he told Rai. Konoe took off his coat and shoes and then removed his gauntlets so that Tokino could see the markings. While he swayed his tail, Tokino's gaze lingered on Konoe's arms, looking as if he was boring into it.
それにしても耳も尾も黒いとまるで違う猫みたいだな。伝説の呪いか。俺がカロへたまたま立ち寄った時にさ、この絵熱出して倒れてた時あったろ。体に変化が起こったのは翌日。
そうだよ。
あ
あ。じゃあ予兆だったのかもしれないな。夢も発熱も。
I mean, yeah.
でもキラや野党の話とか最近出るようになった魔物のこともそうだけどさ、やっぱりなんかおかしいんだよな。
何が？
うまく言えないんだけど、示唆の国が全体的にさ、なんかこう空気が重いっていうかおかしいというか嫌な予感がする。
前にもそんなこと言ってたな。
そうだっけ。でも本当何が起こってもおかしくなさそうだな。
That much is evident by now. Tokino picked up his bowl and drank after he said those solemn words. When they discussed the events in the forest, Konoe thought of Asato. Was he safe? Feelings of guilt tormented him.
呪術師の居場所を知っているか？
Rai, who had just stopped grooming, suddenly asked this question. This cat was always so abrupt. Tokino didn't seem to be offended and simply nodded.
ああ、聞いたことはあります。森の奥の祠に住んでるっていう。
詳しい場所はわかるか？
場所まではちょっと。呪術師に何か用？
こいつのことを聞きに行く。
Rai jerked his chin at Konoe. Although rather disgruntled, Konoe kept quiet.
呪いを解く方法がわかるかもしれん。
俺も実際には見たことないけど、先見ができるとかってやつですよね。確かに何か知ってるかも。
Tokino slowly exhaled and looked up to the ceiling.
なんかすごいな。伝説とかそういうのってどこか遠い世界の話だと思ってた。こんな身近で起きるなんて不思議だね。
Seemingly genuinely impressed, Tokino purred softly. If Konoe's form was seen in town, surely it would cause an uproar. In this world, his existence is that of destruction. Without a doubt, the other cats would think of him that way. But when Tokino saw him like this, he didn't change his outlook at all. Konoe was glad.
ありがとう。
何が？
いや、
Tokino seemed to be taken aback, but he immediately smiled again and then nudged the tip of his nose to Konoe's shoulder.
礼なんて言うなよ。驚いたけど、この絵に会えて嬉しかったし、安心した。どう？初めての乱戦は。
すごい猫の数だな。露店も多いし、 変な形の建物も多い。
Oh, sorry.
田舎者の言葉だな。
Like a country bumpkin.
黙ってろ。
Reflexively, Konoe swatted Ray with his tail after he cut in. At nightfall, Konoe and Rai left Tokino's house.